Let me thank the organization for this. Jetske, wonderful. I am going to speak about how to do an ethnography without race, but an ethnography that takes racism seriously. And since I'm an illustrator, not an explicator, I'm going to illustrate how I do so. I'm going to be doing it focusing on, there we go, this island, which is the island of Saba. It is actually the smallest permanently inhabited country in the Americas. This is how Saba looks. And I'm going to read a bit for you, 23 minutes. So here we go. Who could ask for more? Gerrit, the hotel owner on the Dutch Caribbean island of Saba, a small place named after the Queen of Sheba, was ever so attentive. I can hardly see it. Yeah, ever so attentive. In my hotel room, he had penned these Dutch words on my blackboard. Welcome terug, Francio. Gerrit, who mastered the art of dressing down and resembling a stereotypical beach bum, was not only cordial, but also newsy, or what in West Indian English is termed fast. I love this Caribbean term as it reminds me that social interactions are often unharmonious. To be fast is to engage in a dialogue or action where one quickly jumps to conclusion and pries into what you really want to know. So there's no dance with one another. Gerrit was being fast when he talked about how important discussions on the history and effects of transatlantic slavery are in the Netherlands, and what he had heard from Vito Charles, a young elected official, that I was coming to the island to conduct interviews. He said, helaas, hier doen ze er weinig aan. He continued saying that this had to do with half of Saba's population consisting of Johnson and Hassel's, surnames associated with bare-skinned Sabans with political and economic clout. Their foreparents did not arrive in the Caribbean in chains. Gerrit then lectured me on the lore that in colonial times, zwarte and witte Sabanen, his terms, jointly worked the land, implying slavery on Saba was not as cruel. There we go. Yeah, we're good. I knew this story. I had heard it many times before. In fact, it had even made its way into the very few critical studies about the island's colonial past. This is a quote. You can read it. It's Brian Esperson, an archaeologist. The author from which this quote is taken acknowledges in other parts of his oeuvre that anti-black racism was integral to Saba during colonial times. Saba may not have had large-scale plantations like other colonies in the Caribbean. How could it? It's only 5 square miles of volcanic mountainous rock. But on this island, too, historically, anti-blackness signified, or blackness signified, slavery, poverty, and ignorance. Anti-racism today is about undoing this historical stigma. During my stay on the island, I had met many who told me that while matters had improved, color prejudice was alive and well on Saba. Bare-skinned Sabans of prominent families still held the better jobs, even if you also meet some brown-skinned persons of prominent families also occupying positions of authority. Class and complexion form an intricate mix. As far as that is concerned, Saba is a very Caribbean island, or very West Indian island, where racism, class, and gender remain structuring. You only have to scratch the surface to meet brown-skinned Sabans seeking a past that dignifies them as part of their contemporary struggle to be fully recognized. Here's a poem of the Saban poet-sociologist, Lisanne Charles. She's also doing her PhD here, entitled, Is It Wrong? So since I heard many of these things, saw it in the media, I thought, it was strange to say the least, that Gerrit, who lived so long on the island, was peddling the myth of Saban exceptionalism. Should I read between the lines? Perhaps I thought, like other Sabans, he was playing the role of Saban ambassador, telling outsiders all is well on what they call the unspoiled queen of the Caribbean. I knew from experience that you had to really pry to get Sabans to tell you anything negative about their island or about each other. In performing the role of a historian of the island's slavery past, he positioned me as a black academic researching that institution, though he knew I was an anthropologist studying climate change. We had previously discussed environmental protection, the globalization of viruses such as COVID, and the yearly threat of hurricanes. I had never broached the topic of blackness or anti-blackness. So what made him presuppose my mission was to research black historical misery and the resistance towards that. I asked him whether Vito had told him I was interested in slavery. He said that he had barely spoken to him, but heard I was coming at a time when Vito was going to the Netherlands to represent the island at Kitty Kotti, the annual event commemorating the end of slavery, and had put two and two together. Gerrit probably meant it well, and dwelling with decolonial eyes meant acknowledging this. I actually liked him. He was a decent man who wanted a simple life. Yet, whenever I was transcribing or reading at the pool, he sought to be an intellectual and expert on local ways that he excluded himself from. I likened him to a Robinson Crusoe turned hotel owner, a memorable rendition by the poet-playwright Derek Walcott of our still decolonizing situation. In his play entitled Pantomime, we see Harrod True, a British hotel owner and music hall actor, tries to actually have his employee, Jackson Phillip, join him in playing Defoe's classic novel to attract Western tourists. Phillip, a local Calypsonian, demonstrates that power is never solely in the hands of the one with money and status. He coyly gets through to accept that Caribbean cultural traditions are the equal to the supposed high culture of the UK, and that the time of colonialism where there are masters and servants ought to be no more. Ironically, like True in Walcott's play, Gerrit left the Netherlands to refine himself after a heartbreak. When he first told me about his past using these words, I mischievously asked, "You mean refine yourself?" Gerrit didn't catch my meaning, and he said, yes, refine myself. In Saba, Gerrit found Joy and Anne, the love of his life, who worked as a veterinarian on surrounding islands. Anne was shy and reserved, nodded when Gerrit spoke, but otherwise avoided conversation. I saw them as belonging to the Caribbean, as they had lived longer on Saba than in the Netherlands. What my ancestors from Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas had done in struggle and strife, namely become West Indians, Gerrit and Anne were now undergoing. They were experiencing with Edouard Glissant terms creolization, a limitless mixing with unforeseeable consequences. There were differences, though. Our ancestors never resided in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Mine lived in the colonies, theirs in the colonial metropole. Mine faced and fought against slavery. Theirs more than likely struggled against being exploited workers. Theirs received the suffrage in 1919, mine 30 to 40 years later. Yes, there were historical differences that needed to be acknowledged, but today, from various different starting points, we were both trying to make the Kingdom of the Netherlands a decent federation. By the latter, I mean, in our own ways, my role as a university professor, welcoming to all, Gerrit and Anne in their role as hotel owners, hospitable to all, we were prefiguring in our engagement a kingdom to come, where major public institutions did not humiliate its citizens, denizens, or irregular migrants. And we were not alone. Acknowledging and recognizing the multicultural drift throughout our transatlantic kingdom requires dwelling with decolonial eyes. Now, this is how I explain dwelling with decolonial eyes in the book of 2022. With all the issues that we have today, I still think being Dutch today is coextensive with the multicultural and polyethnic reality of everyday life in all parts of our extended statehood. The work of recognizing this goes hand in hand with undoing multiple modes of discrimination. The latter seems insurmountable whenever I tune in to talk radio, watch the news on TV, read a newspaper, or let myself be informed by a particular social media bubble focused on ethnic tensions. This assessment from France of a Martinican scholar rings through in the Netherlands too, I believe. So true, we have to act against that Skrill horde, but, and there's more, our post-colonial multiculture has become banal in many life worlds. By cracking and breaking through many glass ceilings, people of darker and lighter skin complexion stemming from various ethnicities and religious affiliations today occupy many stations, almost all the stations in Dutch society. Colonial traces remain in the form of habits of action enacting discriminatory double standards, but the time of formal colonialism is over. The battles of today are not those of yesterday, even though there are traces. And I think the same holds for Seba. This is Vito. Vito was a young, well-educated politician from a respectable brown-skinned family, and he explained that the old image of Seba divided into descendants of Africans and Europeans did not correspond to contemporary reality. Newcomers did not correspond to the reality of today. He said that many people of different backgrounds were making Seba their home. He believed that the new Seba would be co-created with all the incomers, and they had to undo what he termed colonialism. So as we sipped coffee being served by an American waitress with recently arrived Filipinos greeting Vito, I understood what he meant. Soon these people or their children would be Dutch citizens too, Dutch citizens on the other part of the kingdom. They would be part of the new Seba, and some of them might travel to the Netherlands. The necessary twin of every politics of recognition, namely economic redistribution and class justice, was often neglected by anti-racist champions. Redistribution meant taming and superseding capitalism. But this is unthinkable. The focus on ethnic diversity and ideal intersectionality within a capitalist setup only goes so far. This fact that redistribution gets short shrift amongst many anti-racists in positions like Vito may have to do with an argument that the likes of the sociologist Orlando Patterson and the political science Adolf Reed Jr. have been championing for some time. Namely, they say, the class position and predilection of social movement actors and progressive anti-racist intellectuals matters. Microaggressions and institutional racism are very real barriers to socioeconomic ascent for the black middle class and the black deserving poor. Their trials due to the figment of pigment becomes paramount. When they speak for themselves or are ventriloquized by progressive intellectuals and scholars, class injustice is minimized, or sometimes it even drops out of the equation. Class becomes classism, and class is not classism. Classism is a discriminated identity category that should be studied using an intersectional lens. Now, I work as a researcher, like all of you, in the system world, and was tempted many a times to interpret Gerrit's way of structuring his understanding of self and others as emanating from a colonially derived psychocultural archive. But Vito helped me not to do so. Gerrit and Anne were never mentioned when Vito spoke about racism or implicit bias. He told me you have to look at the person. Not because they're white, they're racist, and not because they're black, they're anti-racist, he would say. Gerrit and Anne were persons born in the Netherlands who lived most of their lives in Seba. I knew more about the Netherlands, and they knew more about contemporary Seba, and that's the way we engage with one another. Gerrit and Anne would refer to themselves as blanc, a term that until recently most beige-skinned natives in the Netherlands used. Activists introduced the word wit as an alternative, seeking to create parity with zwart, black, the acceptable self-description for brown-skinned Dutch people of sub-Saharan descent. Gerrit and Anne seemed oblivious to this discussion. I asked Gerrit about the discussion in the Netherlands. He said he had heard of it, reading some online newspapers, but paid it no mind. He went on to say that blanc had nothing to do with white superiority or anything like that. I was zwart and they were blanc. It was simply the way the Lord willed it. I asked him What was the difference, if any, between blank and wit? He looked quizzically at me and responded, ja, gewoon, ik ben blank. Ik ben toch niet wit, pointing at the white wall of his hotel. Gerrit then paused for a while. He was weighing his words and continued, jij bent ook niet zwart. Maar ja, ik mag niet meer, je weet wel zeggen. Ook hier niet. Later, Gerrit explained that when he said, je mag niet zeggen, he was referring to what Americans call the N-word. Men like Gerrit and Anne lived on an island where blank had not become contentious, but the N-word had. And I never heard him or any other Saban use it in public. Vito told me it was used derogatorily in the past, but black was the term of preference now. Afro-Saban was chic and rarely used. And I think the reason why blank is not the word, because in Papiamento it's blanco, and they don't have a term for wit. So that's why it's not a term of struggle there. I told Gert and Anne that I thought they were part of the Caribbean. Gerrit found the reasoning smart, but was unconvinced, responding, ja, dat is waar, maar vergis je niet, ik blijf altijd een Nederlander, een buitenstaander. Je weet wat ik bedoel. De mensen hier zijn aardig, maar ik word nooit beschouwd als een Sabaan. By the mensen here, the people here, he meant the so-called native Sabans, people like Vito. That Vito considered him part of the flock was impossible to accept, as he was working with an implicit conception of autochthony. And I think many persons in the Netherlands work with that implicit conception. He thought that Sabans were doing the same. He told me that native Sabans had something that he and other newcomers did not. This land belonged to them, and they to the land. I found that it was much more complicated. I met some persons from other islands whose parents or grandparents were Sabans who were never considered Sabans. And I met others with almost exactly the same profile who were. I even met a person from the Netherlands who had even successfully held office in Saba and was considered very much part of the flock. Being considered Saban had to do with behavior and disposition, not with something autochthonous. Fitting in, being open to native Sabans, engaging in their rituals, and not being, as they told me, standoffish, arrogant, or bashful. That was the route to fully belonging. And I think it had to do with that for a very long time, this island was considered the most poor and backward place in the Caribbean and the wider Dutch kingdom. And it had led local Sabans to be quite apprehensive and mistrustful. And being Saban was never codified. That Sabans who Gerrit considered native, people with influence like Vito, referred to him as a new Saban, did not matter. He considered it a compliment of an enlightened man. He also beamed but remained stubborn in his autochthony logic when I told him that Chris Johnson also paid him that compliment. Chris was the son of Will Johnson, a key figure in Saban politics who served as a politician and high-ranking civil servant for about 50 years. Gerrit described the older Johnson as part of the island's bearskin elite, but Will identified himself as a West Indian and an admirer of Fidel Castro and a staunch anti-colonialist. Chris followed in his father's footsteps, holding office as an elected commissioner and later representing the Netherlands government on St. Martin, so a neighboring island. We met on Saba, and there he spoke about his further ambitions. Chris was a kind of self-taught sociologist, and we often discussed the concept of belonging. He believed that Saba was born due to the fact that his ancestors and the ancestors of people who experienced transatlantic slavery and the Middle Passage had worked to make the land their own. So work was the basis for belonging. Chris emphasized the importance of remembering history, including the involvement of Dutch elites in transatlantic slavery. He noted that while slavery was incomparable, other groups, such as the Irish and the Redlegs, also suffered. For Chris, the Caribbean experience was one of racial hierarchies and inequality. But it could be improved if everyone, including newcomers like Gerrit and Anne, worked towards a better future. He questioned whether they would join in building a Caribbean where there would be no first and second-class citizens. I questioned whether most so-called native Sabans also dreamed his dream. Now I come to the end. This ethnographic account reflects my way of writing against race. I see myself as a public anthropologist resisting all forms of raciology. I accept, in other words, the hailing of those scholars who call for the, and I quote, this is of Paul Gilroy, the specific, deliberate, and patient overcoming of the claims of raciology and racialized sovereignty. I think autochthony is about racialized sovereignty in our scholarship and in the activism. My description of my interlocutors as beige and brown-skinned are not politically correct substitutes for white and black. The latter are, even though we use it as conventions, they are racist classifications which have become conventions. They're classifications. They are arbitrary symbolic markers which explains why Walter White is on my right, the NAACP leader in the 1930s could be classified as a black man in the USA, and 19th century anthropologist could consider the Hamitic-speaking people in the north of Africa as a branch of the Caucasian race. Beige and brown, in contradistinction to black and white, are icons, iconic descriptions that resemble human and more than human reference. Dark or lighter brown skin tones resemble twigs of trees, fertile earth and clay, or crayon of the same color. Such also holds for the iconic signifier beige. It is my imperfect way of heeding Jamaica Kincaid's observation. There she goes, yeah. Jamaica Kincaid's observation to write humanly, with which I began this essay. In doing so, I approach dominant academic terms with skepticism. In my public anthropology, I propose a trans-Caribbean perspective, inspired by Edouard Glissant's idea that the Caribbean is best described, these are quotes of him, as multiple series of relationships that cannot be reduced to a strictly delineated cultural area or cultural people, end of quote. I believe that anyone like Gerrit or Anne can belong to the Caribbean if they choose. The Caribbean, as I see it, challenges our inherited universality. And our inherited universality is the racist division of the world into 7 ethno-racial continents, which many who do resistance discourses to racism ironically still uphold. After all, the faces of the globe are Caribbean faces. And given that this is the case today also in the Netherlands, it is apt to think of the Netherlands as a Caribbean island. Race remains a divisive fiction that hinders an eco-inclusive politics of I-manity, the fact that intersubjectively each I in our species-specific form humans idiosyncratically. The world's rich diversity is often reduced to raciological markers, subsuming our singularities. My public anthropology invites us to think, write, and act against these inherited universalities. In a world suffering from the effects of the Capitalocene, just heard the first one, we must remember that racism also blackened the planet and animal life, treating the earth as an object. So anti-racism was always, to me, about we who human and those that co-appear otherwise. Thank you.
Great. So it's really an honor to get to have this brief conversation with you in public, but I'm excited to maybe follow up when we're not sitting on a stage as well. So, and I'm really fascinated by your perspective and the talk you just gave as a social scientist, but also just as someone from the US who has encountered these terms and the politics around them in different ways, and then has been, it's been very interesting to come to the Netherlands, and I find this in my teaching. So I teach, and I've taught African politics here at the UvA to master's students, and then have also had a chance at last year's Harvest Day to hear Philomena Essed talk about everyday racism and sort of how that term was received. But I'm struck by, in particular, sort of what you left us with in terms of writing against race. And I wonder if you could say more about how you approach this also in your teaching, and if students are wanting to do, this kind of work here in the Netherlands, what would that look like to do this kind of work?
Good one, good one. Thanks. Thanks for being, and thank you for listening. I know it was a long story. You just said you did do African politics. I used to. This next year I'll teach that course again. It's called Anthropologies of the Black Atlantic. So I think from out of the Black Atlantic. The Black Atlantic is conceived as a negative continent. It's not a continent, but it troubles the notion of these ethno-racial continents by Paul Gilroy. So in that course, I tried to get students to recognize that continental thinking is actually new and that it's co-conceived in the 19th century with all the pan movements, pan-Slavism, pan-Africanism, you name it, all the pans. And that at that particular moment in time, you see a reconstruction of the world into these ethno-racial continents, and you see that the social sciences and humanities, even the ones that are trying to be progressive, participate in this. And therefore, Gilroy and Stuart Hall and Glissant that I spoke about, their work is to undo this, this mode of thinking, and Gilroy does it with the Black Atlantic as this negative continent. Edouard Glissant does it with archipelagic thinking. So therefore, if you're studying something, the archipelago is constantly different. And that means you can have an archipelago in which you have, if you're studying, for instance, I'll give you an example, you're studying the fact that on Aruba, many youngsters have taught themselves Korean to be able to follow Korean movies. Then the archipelago of the Caribbean includes Korea in that thinking. So therefore, you're not in these separate things. You're just saying Korea is here too because that's part of the cultural mix. And that's what you describe.
I love that. And I love just sort of, as you're speaking, I'm picturing kind of the world map that we have in, grade school and things on the wall. And what if we, I've seen sort of versions of it that flip it the other way from what we're used to and different ways of thinking about these relationships. And you also, I think something that you said just now, but also in your talk, how to think about history and maybe history of certain terms, but also the history of certain stories. And you use the words myth and lore. And I also noticed that you said, I was struck by when you said the battles of today are not those of yesterday, and sort of finding the balance maybe between seeing things through decolonial eyes, being aware of the history behind certain terms and myths, but also not, getting sort of caught up in fighting the battles of the past. Can you talk a little more about that
Good one.
tension or maybe some implications?
Look, dwelling with decolonial eyes, as I see it, is that you actually do a kind of radical empiricism. And all that means is that you actually include everything that's there. So which means, to me, there are many people with all kinds of prejudices and so forth, but given that they have to live with other persons, from time to time they break out of the prejudice. And at one and the same time, they're prejudicial. So you have to be able to describe all of this. That's dwelling with decolonial eyes, because I think many people are trying. It's difficult for them, but they're trying in many different kinds of ways. You asked a second question, and I'm trying to figure out what it was again. Sorry.
Sure. So you were said at one point that the struggles of today are not those of yesterday, but then also having this awareness of history.
That Trans-Caribbean option that I yesterday I gave a keynote only on the Trans-Caribbean option. It presupposes that thinking and acting is always being haunted by the voices of persons who lived, who still need their justice claims to happen. So therefore, there's always people who are not around when you're doing research, and you have to find a way of including those voices. There are also voices of the people who still have to live, so you necessarily need to think, how is your writing and your research preparing the ground so that those persons will be able to live an ethical and dignified life? So I think part of doing social sciences or humanities is actually ethics. And therefore, there are traces, but it's not exactly the same. It can't be exactly the same.
Great, thank you so much. I think I also wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned around struggles for redistribution and sort of seeing I think you had a lovely phrase about taming capitalism, and I think it also relates to some of the ideas that Joyita mentioned in terms of ways in which lifestyles in countries like the Netherlands maybe need to change to think about how we can achieve justice on a global scale. And I was wondering if you, maybe bringing together these threads of ethics and redistribution, and also in the context of working against racism, sort of different ways to navigate that.
Yeah. Where's Joyita? It was a powerful story. A powerhouse. Yeah, that's what I said. Look, to me, if you conceive of anti-racism or racism as always including the more than human, that means that you cannot presuppose a capitalism in the later 21st century, you can't do that. We need a different type of order. And part of what we do in the limited sense, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, in the limited sense, is write in such a way that tries to get people to rethink their common senses. So I think redistribution means the end of capitalism. I don't think redistribution means within capitalism. I think that will always go haywire given all the things that Joyita was speaking about because of power and differences and so forth. And some will be winners and losers. And then you might have which is important, a kind of politics of diversity, of diversifying and so forth. That's all good. But that is within the capitalist order, and I think it only goes so far. I think a lot of people remain on the bottom and remain being considered as infrahumans, if human at all.
Okay, this is a lot to sit with, and I wonder if maybe just in reflecting on also your work on climate change. I know that I've read your profile of your NVO project about islanders at the helm, studying, bringing together different knowledge practices. And I was wondering if you could maybe just leave us briefly with some of what you've been learning about these different knowledge practices that you've encountered in that work and how they relate to some of these questions.
Good one. Let me say two things. One is that we have an exhibition of that program in Shebang, CBK in Amsterdam, I think Amsterdam Zuidoost. Lovely exhibition, which actually, for a visual anthropologist of Matthijs van der Poort, I don't know if Matthijs is here, but Shirley and Manuelson, who produced the work depicting what we actually are finding and so forth. Methodologically, if I say you have to at least be open to those that are not here anymore, one of the ways that it's being done is by a postdoctoral fellow, Gregory Richardson. And what he does is he uses old calypso songs from Trinidad or from Aruba, from St. Martin, and he meets people and they listen to these songs. And then they have a conversation about, well, what were you doing when this song was happening? So a song like, oh Lord, the village is burning down. So they're listening to this song in 1967, and then he says, that was the time that you had this terrible hurricane, Donna, that hit the Caribbean. You're on Aruba. How is that connected to Donna? And then they start to speak about people who lived, who they knew on those islands, and the stories, therefore their stories come back in. So they speak their own stories, they become ventriloquists for those stories, and then he tries to connect these two to the questions of justice, the questions of materiality of homes that can be flooded or not. And that's a way of doing a kind of ethnography that brings in all these different types of things. I could go on, I could explain. There's another one who looks at, on Saba, there was, Saba and St. Eustatius, a whole lot of goats that were gunned down because it was said it was environmentally better to do so. So this other researcher that is listening to the future is asking, if you are so disrespectful to life, what does that do to your society? What does that do to interhuman relationships? And how is this a echo of settler colonial practices of thinking that you can just order a society because it's good for you and good for the environment. So these are, and many of them are writing up either their theses or writing up articles about this, but they're trying to do it through that Trans-Caribbean option. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and
You're
I look
welcome.
forward to checking out that exhibition.
Thanks.
Thank you.